Welcome. Thank you for joining. We have a really transformational program for you today. We're going to talk about something that's new, it's emerging, it's something that I think is transformational for prosecutor offices. What we're going to talk about today are data programs and how a data program can be utilized at a prosecutor's office to implement reform, efficiency, safety, and also support prosecutorial independence. And the reason why I'm thrilled to share this with you all today with these extraordinary panelists is because I know it works and it will help your office. My name is Allison Pierre. I'm a lawyer and I'm also a former prosecutor. I head Innovative Prosecution Consulting. We partner as a technical research partner with district attorney offices, and we have a tremendous data team from American University. I'm also really thankful that we have a tremendous panel. Ramsey County Attorney John Choi is with us from St. Paul, Minnesota. And we have Commonwealth Attorney Stephen Descano from the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney's Office in Virginia. And then, of course, Dr. Jema Michael from the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney's Office. She's a data director there. Thank you all for joining.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. What I'm going to do really quickly now is do some housekeeping, then we're going to dive into the substance. This is being recorded. It will be posted on the ABA's YouTube channel. And we also will have a situation where we can take questions during the program. So please, we want this to be interactive. We want to answer your questions during the program. Also, this is not a CLE credited program, but we will go for roughly an hour. And let me just say this, and then we'll dive right in. As we all know, prosecutors are the most powerful actor in the criminal justice system. And having a data program is an incredible tool for prosecutors to utilize to address racial disparities, mass incarceration, efficiency, safety. It is the future of our work. And it's something that I know that I want everyone to see, that these two offices are models for the nation as to what they have done in their office with their data programs. So let's get started. Are we all ready? Yes. I love the thumbs up. We need the energy. I'm going to first ask both electeds to tell me, before we get into the substance of what we're going to talk about, what made you want to be a prosecutor? What brought you to this work? And I'm going to start with County Attorney Ramsey or John.
Well, thanks, Allison, for that invitation to talk a little bit about my journey in being a prosecutor. You know, prior to being elected back in 2010 for the first time for this role to be the chief prosecutor in Ramsey County, I was the appointed St. Paul city attorney. And in my jurisdiction, we have a system by which city attorneys will prosecute misdemeanor level crimes, and the county attorney does the felonies as well as the juvenile cases, as well as providing corporation counsel and doing all the civil work for the county. But prior to being appointed as the city attorney, I did not have any background in criminal prosecution at all. In fact, I'd be the first to tell you that I probably avoided those classes in law school. But I think taking the job, I had the background to be the civil corporation counsel for the city, but I spent more time, I think, trying to learn the prosecution function. And I found myself asking just a lot of questions, and a lot of things did not make sense. And we didn't really have anything to have data programs. We didn't have research. We weren't evaluating kind of what we were doing. And quite frankly, I was just really shocked by all of the things that just did not make sense if you just started pulling the data and starting to look at your caseload, where prosecutors were spending their time. And I fell in love with the broader aspect of criminal justice and working towards trying to make a system worthy of its name and connecting with our community and using data and research as a foundation for the change. And so having that opportunity to use data and research to effectuate good change, to make better outcomes for our community, the people that we serve, which would include the victims of crime, as well as those accused and those who are harmed by horrible things that happen in our community. I fell in love with that function. And so I've been at it ever since. And I am now probably finishing up my 13th year in this role, and a big part, and we'll talk about more just how we rely so heavily upon research and data to make change happen, to defend our decisions, to explain what's happening in the justice system, and then also, most importantly, to have conversations and to engage our public in the most important thing that they need to recognize is that they own the legal system. The criminal justice system belongs to the people. And you can't have, I think, good conversations just based upon anecdotes or just things that we've always done and repeated in the past. We need to have new thinking, and you can't have new thinking unless you have good data and research to start those conversations, to engage that public to understand that they actually own these outcomes.
Mm. I love your comment about new thinking, and I know that probably resonates with you, Steve. Tell us what brought you to this work.
Well, what brought, unlike John, I was a career prosecutor even before having this role. I was right out of law school. I became a federal prosecutor, and the reason I became a prosecutor to begin with was it goes all the way back to a conversation I had with my dad when I was about 12 years old, and the teacher told me that I should be a lawyer. I didn't know what a lawyer was. My parents are high school graduates; they are not college graduates. I didn't know any lawyers. My dad's a guy who wore steel-toed boots every day going to the DuPont plant for 35 years. So I asked him about this, and I'll never forget the response he gave me. He basically told me, he goes, look, much of society is set up to take advantage of people like us. It really is for the wealthy and the powerful, but the one place where you can get a fair shake is in the law. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you're black or white, you can get a fair shake in the law. And that really appealed to me. And then the idea of building community safety through the prosecutorial function, that appealed to me as well. And that's why I right out of law school became a prosecutor. But what I can tell you is it probably within a couple of weeks of being a prosecutor, I learned that everything that my dad told me was wrong. It absolutely mattered if you were rich or poor. It absolutely mattered if you were black or white. It absolutely mattered where you came from. All you had to do was sit in court for a sentencing docket once or twice, and you got that. So I became very, very critical of the way that the system works and wanted to change it, wanted to bring some of that new thinking that John mentioned, because I really do believe that safety is important, but we can have safety and we can have justice at the same time. And through some things I did in my community, first setting up a police civilian review oversight board, I got a chance to talk to a lot of my community. And what I found was that a lot of people here in Fairfax County had the same thoughts that I did, the same critiques that I had of the justice system, but they didn't know how to effectuate change. And they had this feeling, but I'm sure we'll talk about, there wasn't any data. They didn't know, they knew in their gut, but they didn't know in their head. And after doing that for some period of time, I realized that if somebody's going to change things, if somebody's going to bring some of that new thinking into this function here in Fairfax County, Virginia, it had to be me because nobody else was stepping up. That's why I'm in the role that I'm in now, because, of course I care about community safety. My wife and my daughter and I live in this community. I want it to be safe. But at the same time, I care just as much about making sure that people who walk into this courthouse get a fair shake every single day of the week. And that's why I'm here in this job, because I hold both of those things in my head and my heart at the same time. And only by bringing, as John said, that new thinking into this elected role can we actually have that in a community.
I want to stay on that topic of new thinking, because there has been an emergence of reform prosecutors that have been elected over the past several years, but they faced opposition. And I want to talk to you, John, about your task force that you sit on with the American Bar Association. Tell us about what is, in simple terms, prosecutorial independence.
Well, it's that notion that underpinning our democracy and our judicial process, that the prosecutor has to be independent. The prosecutor has to not be influenced by bias or partisan types of decision making. And right now, with the emergence of new voices that are being elected across the country as prosecutors who want to think differently, there's a lot of pushback. And in fact, what's happening is that you've got other actors in the democratic system who are trying to utilize their their powers, but for political purposes to undermine that independence and to influence how what our future might look like. And what that influence is to try to go back to the status quo. We have these strong paradigms or mental models or whatever you want to call it that are so ingrained in our society about kind of how we get to safety, how we find justice in our community. And they are just rock solid in terms of how they've kind of developed our nation. But the reality, and as Steve talked about, and it's kind of like what Steve's dad was talking about, they're not necessarily true. If you do a critical dive into our current systems, what you will find is that the things that we've always done don't always lead to safety and justice and the truth. Like, for instance, we see on TV, like a lot of things that might happen in the justice system would be at trial. But the truth is that less than 2% of cases actually go to trial. In fact, we live in a world in which we have a plea bargaining system. We have massive racial disparity. We have massive amounts of people who are convicted of crimes and who have to live with continued collateral consequences of their past conviction, despite having done everything that we have asked them to do to make amends. We have a system in which we incarcerate more people than anywhere else on the planet. I think in many instances, unnecessarily wasting public expenditures or public resources. And there is a better way. And so in order, I think, to ensure that we maintain this important notion of the prosecutor being independent, to be able to prioritize the scarce resources that he or she has to be able to connect with what its community wants in terms of the outcomes in its justice system, we need to have data and research to, number one, first, to better understand what we currently do and to explain to the public that maybe there's a better way. And then, of course, if we are making changes, it's so critical then to be transparent and to show the change, to show the positive outcomes or the negative outcomes, whatever that might be. But in order for us to move forward, we have a lot of educating and a lot of, I think, deconstructing of those current paradigms. And right now, I think we have newer prosecutors who are being elected on reform platforms and they want to make change. And the natural state of things is to go back to the status quo or to stop that type of change. And we're just in that moment right now where there's just a lot of tension. But I think the path forward and the way to change that foundation is through conversations that are based around data and research.
You mentioned something about the notion of new thinking and trying to utilize this data program to talk with the community. What I want to ask next is to Steve, tell us about some of the opposition that you've experienced. And that really ties into prosecutorial independence, because in certain states like Texas and Florida, there's been incidents where prosecutors have been suspended or attempted to be removed from office. So tell us about what you've experienced in Fairfax, Steve.
I've experienced quite a bit, so I could to talk at length. But very shortly, in Virginia, I'm very, very lucky that it's not like Florida where our governor can unilaterally essentially kick a prosecutor out of their job, as has happened a couple of times down in Florida. However, one of the things that we do have in Virginia is we have a recall system. I have survived 2 separate recalls. And since we're right outside of DC, these recalls are being put on by, big, powerful people that you would know. For example, I know a Supreme Court justice's wife, you can guess which one, was involved in one of my recalls. There are large groups such as the Heritage Foundation that had played some part in these recalls. Of course, we survived those. We had our Republican Attorney General, who is not an ally of mine, I should say, does not see the justice system the same way that I do, multiple times go to the legislature to try to undermine the authority of local elected prosecutors, specifically aimed at me by name. Thankfully, all of those efforts at legislation have failed. And of course, I just last year was reelected again for another term, and that was a very contentious election. Now, the other thing that is a little bit less on the nose than those types of things is some of the coordinated press and some of the coordinated attacks that we see, right? And I think that's why it's so important. John mentioned having these conversations with our community based around data. I don't know if any of you have watched the news over the last couple of weeks, but what we're seeing on like Sinclair stations and Fox News is this coordinated effort to make a quote unquote migrant crime crisis be something that scares voters. And what we see for individuals who have a certain less reform, the traditional view of the way that the world should work, is that they are very, very good at taking one example and trying to have a coordinated argument that's an entire worldview that is going to try to infiltrate and set the bounds of a narrative and the bounds of a conversation to the detriment of reform-minded prosecutors. And I think that is why having a data program, and not just having it, but communicating it to the people in your community is really, really important. Because if you are always on the defensive, responding to a bad faith news story or what have you, you're already losing. If you're explaining, you're losing. And let's face facts. If you want to be a reform-minded elected prosecutor, the key word is elected. You have to win the trust of your community. But if you have a data program, you can offensively go and talk about the data and show that what you're doing is working. So in many ways, you're not responding. You're setting the terms of the debate. You're inoculating your community to bad faith efforts. And quite frankly, I think that is one of the reasons why we have been successful here, because we recognized very early on, actually, before I even came into office, that with the reforms I wanted to implement, I knew I was going to be getting attacked. I know I was going to be getting attacked in a coordinated way from right across the river, from some real big hitter political pros, and that the way to survive was to set the terms of the narrative ourselves. And the only way that we could do it is by having data, because I can only get people to trust me on my word for so long if I don't have anything to point to. And that, to me, is really the power of data when it comes to setting the narrative and giving reformers like John and I the room to run to make these reforms to prove that they're working. That gives us the space.
And that's the potent power of data. That's what's so incredible about it. And now that we've talked about some of the highlights of prosecutorial independence, I want to get into how to build a data program. The purpose is just to stay high level, to give some basic tips about how to start. And I'm going to pivot to you, Jema. I want to just ask a couple of things that you would suggest for a jurisdiction that's smaller, for instance, or middle size, in terms of the couple of basic things that they should think about. First couple of steps. Oh, I think we have you on mute. There we go. Perfect.
Two of the basic steps for us was first to create standard operating procedures for entering the data in our case management system. We spent a few years sort of developing and retraining staff on how to enter data. That was huge. That definitely increased the reliability of our data in the system. We also developed really robust quality assurance processes. And so we actually use dashboards to assess the quality of our data. For example, we have dashboards that we can look at to say, hey, certain cases haven't been updated, or some cases are missing disposition information or sentencing information. And in fact, we actually have our admin staff have their own dashboard so that they can track some of the updates that they need to do. So those two pieces have been critical for developing, I think, a solid data program where the attorneys can rely on the data to reference, right? They can reference the data in the case management system and rely on it, but also we who are sort of either doing the analytics, or in Steve's case, those who are managing, can rely on the data for managerial purposes. So those two pieces have been critical. I would just say one final thing is, if you have a case management system, is plan to do some recustomizing. We have definitely had to put a lot of energy and some money into recustomizing our data, our case management system, so that we can collect the data that we feel like we need to do the kind of analyses that we need. So those are kind of my 3 points.
Thank you. And another key thing to remember is you don't have to do this alone. My team, which is comprised of data scientists from American University, has partnered with the Virginia office to help support their work in building a data program. So if you're an office, you can look to other outside entities as well as building internally. But now let's focus on community engagement. And I'm glad that I think Steve brought up what's been happening in the news the past few weeks about how candidates tap into their communities. I want to talk about how to use a data program and a dashboard to communicate with your constituents. I'm going to start with you, John, and then we'll pivot to Steve.
Yeah, so we have a public dashboard, and I would describe it as a good one, but also relatively basic. And so, we'll send out the link to my public dashboard, but it has information about you can slice our data any way you want, and this is about just being transparent, right? That this is our data. We want to engage people in conversation, but also we have this very important point that it's just only one slice of the entire justice system. And so there are limitations, right? And so I think there's some questions later about just some of the, as we launched this, about kind of the pitfalls and things of that sort. But we are very transparent with, like, for instance, just like the people that get charged in our office. We cut the numbers across race, gender. You can do all of that searching yourself, and you can, I guess, make your own conclusions. I think it's just important to get to that point where you're just very transparent about who you're prosecuting, what kind of cases you're prioritizing. We also have internal diversity numbers for our office, so you could see the progress that we're making with regard to hiring and retention, and just some of the other performance factors or indicators that we will report directly to our county board. But I think what's more important, and again, it's like what I'm talking about here is just our data, but we have to recognize and engage the public and also stakeholders that in order to actually come to the right conclusions and to find the solutions, we have to look across the board, and we have to look at data that exists in our court system. We have to look at data that exists, especially within our police function. There is so much, I feel like, and I'm sure Steve can talk about this too, is that there's this, as people push back on the status quo, there is so much attention paid to what is the punishment of the individual or what is the outcome of a particular case. But the truth is, if we want to talk about safety, we have to start thinking about the data that existed prior to us even receiving the situation. So looking at police data and clearance rates, and looking at what's not coming to the attention of the prosecutor, because the research will tell you over and over again, it's not so much what the punishment is, it's more about whether or not those who commit crimes actually get caught. And the truth across America is that homicide rates, clearance rates for homicide and non-fatal shootings and auto theft, they're abysmal. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that if anybody looked up their auto theft clearance rate in their jurisdiction, it probably would be less than 2%. That's why people continue to steal cars. So then we can engage in conversations about how do we work together across stakeholders. So we oftentimes will employ partnerships with research organizations or academic institutions to do that deep dive to understand like how we can improve things. So as an example, for our youth justice initiative, we have a project called Reimagine Justice for Youth that we launched back in 2018, 2019, and we have now a way in which we share some of our decision making with stakeholders about what we do with a particular case, right? But before we did that, we embarked on this journey to do 10 years of historical research on our current youth justice system to understand what kind of outcomes we actually produced. And what did we produce? Well, what we produced is massive racial disparity. The more contact that somebody had with our office, the more likely that they were actually going to end up in the adult prison system. And so we had all of that historical data. And so now the project is we've launched our change, right? And we've already seen some great successes. Like, for instance, the success rate across race is now equalized. Before the project, we had massive disparity on who was successful on any type of alternative, and then whatever that the program was and what it produced. The success rates were abysmal across if you did it across race. Today, we've made that equal in terms of the outcomes, and we're going to study this for the next 10 years. And
What's really unique,
yeah.
Understood. What's unique is that you have historical data. That's something that's pretty rare in most prosecutor offices. And I see Jema nodding because I think it is pretty rare. But let me ask Steve, because this community engagement piece is very important to me. How do you talk about data, a dashboard, to people who have no background, like our family and friends who do not understand the high technical part of a dashboard? Tell us about that, Steve.
Well, I mean, that's a great question, because as you know, I got into data and dashboards very, very early in my tenure as Commonwealth attorney, and I feel like I've learned quite a bit over that 5 or so years. You know, it really changed my expectation. I was, you know, being a lawyer and surrounding myself with a lot of lawyers, you know, I had just come maybe with the expectation that the general public understood more about the nuts and bolts of the justice system writ large. And what I come to find very, very quickly is that's not the case. You know, Law and Order is it's great entertainment, but it's not instructive, right? So, you know, talking about dashboards, you know, just throwing a dashboard at somebody doesn't have an effect, right? You need to contextualize what people are looking at, and it's really, you know, an opportunity to educate about the system writ large itself. So talking to people about dashboards, it's really, you know, you're telling people about the value of data. You're trying to tell them about connecting the values that they have as a voter and a community member, how using the data is, having the dashboards, having the data is going to be valuable, because it allows us to, you know, allows the public to check in on us. It allows us to manage our people. There's a huge management component of this that I know we'll talk about later, but it is the proof of what we are doing. And I think when you explain the value of dashboards that way, people understand, oh, this is a good thing. A lot of this is for me, the public. I don't need to be walking through the courthouse with this dashboard. You are opening a window into this black box as a service to me, the community member. As far as the actual dashboard itself, I think it's really, really important to not make it too confusing. You know, we had an expectation when we first started where we put, and we still put everything out there, but it was more like, hey, here's a bunch of stuff. And what we learned is that to connect with the community, what we need to do is we need to use the data to tell stories, and we need to contextualize the data that we are showing. So it is about putting forth that data, but building the scaffolding around us so people understand what you're trying to explain to them and what the outcome is. It's almost like writing a legal brief, John. You want to put what you're asking for up front. You want to put your conclusion up front. Don't make the reader do too much work. And then the other thing that I found really a lesson that I learned, and I think that I really learned that when we put out our bond data dashboard, which is to not be afraid of the data. You know, what you're trying to do with dashboards is you're trying to build trust with the community. And one of the ways that you can build trust with the community, we did it. When we released our first dashboard, I had numbers that I didn't like, that were not in line with our policy. And instead of trying to hide those numbers, when we released it, we affirmatively said, we're going to be back to you in 6 months. And we see these areas of opportunities in these two areas. We're going to train on it. We're going to work on it. And when we come to you in 6 months with more data, I'm telling you, I think those numbers are going to be better. And when we came back to them in 6 months, because we revamped things and we tightened and we made our office work a little bit better. had people really adhering to the policy more than they had before. Those numbers got better, and we went out and we trumpeted that. And when I go out in the community now, I not only hear, wow, those numbers look great, blah, 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 but I also hear, that was really great that you didn't just wait until everything was fixed. You showed us where the areas of opportunity were, and you showed us that by training on it and working on it, you can actually affect change, and the data back that up. And for us, that was a big example of using data to build trust, not only educate, but build trust through data.
I think that's an important point, because I know there's hesitancy for electeds to release what they think is neutral or bad data. There's a little fear there because they don't want it to be used against them, especially if they're running for re-election. And so these are things that we have to talk about. And what I would love to do right now, I'm going to pivot to Jema, because I want to show the audience what we've done in Fairfax and show what an actual dashboard looks like. And while Jema is getting that up for us, here we go. Let's start with this one. And Steve, I'm going to have you just talk through one point that you think is the most important part about this entire dashboard. Steve?
So that is our this is our red flag law dashboard, and this tracks getting an emergency risk order, how many we have, but also how to make it that longer term 6-month red flag law order. And the most important point to me is that wide divergence, when the two lines are very narrow and then they get wide. What that width represents is us looking at the data and us not being happy with what was happening, and going and using that data as an impetus for us to go relook at our policies, relook at our procedures, see where we were missing some things, and fill those gaps and retrain. And by doing those things, what you can see is that light blue line that represents the number of times we took an emergency order and turned it into a long-standing order, which is what we want. It jumped precipitously because we trained around it. And not only did it jump, but you can see the other data points, it stayed. So to me, that is showing the community that we care about their values and that we are doing things in line with their values, but also proving that when we see an issue through data, we can train around it and make it better, and we have the data to back that up.
And it's a wonderful example of showcasing what the office is doing to keep constituents safe.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you what, I'm a reformer, but community safety is job one. And I know in my community, what people, even though we're the safest large community, over 1 million people in the country, like everywhere else, we care about gun violence. And our community here in Fairfax is sophisticated, and they know that there are many ways that you get at gun violence, not just through prosecution, but actually using civil red flag law orders to proactively try to stop shootings before they happen. So our community is very, very pleased with what we've been able to show in this dashboard.
Jema, now I want to pivot to the bond dashboard, and I'm going to ask Steve to take us through. Steve, tell us about first the policy, the rationale for it, and then what the goal was and the outcome.
So our bond policy is we don't do cash bond, because we don't want to penalize poor people for being poor, and we don't want to give people who are rich but dangerous but rich the opportunity to buy their way out of jail pending trial. Both of those things actually aid community safety. They improve community safety. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to focus in on dangerousness and hold people who are a danger, not people who aren't. And the other thing that was really important, so that's the policy. But the thing that's important about that dashboard is about our decision making, right? So we set up a structure where we are tracking not just outcomes, but the reasons why our attorneys are making the decisions that they're making. And what we can see when we look at that is that who we are holding individuals who are accused. Well, first of all, this board right here, where the black line is releases, and you can see nonviolent felonies, nonviolent misdemeanors. We are recommending release in the vast majority of these cases. But when you flip it and you go to the violent felonies, violent misdemeanors, you'll see the lines kind of reverse. And what that shows us and what it shows the community is that we're keeping people safe in the streets, but we're keeping them safe in the system as well. We're not holding people because we're afraid of our own shadow, because we're smart enough to know that holding somebody pretrial that doesn't represent a danger to the community creates more risk to the community long term. And again, this is a thing that we're able to show aligns with the values of our voters, aligns with the values of our community, because they're sophisticated and they know that following that policy keeps them safe. I will also tell you to go back to something that we talked about earlier. You know, now it's migrant crime crisis, but before it was cash bail and, oh, all these people are getting out and this and that. When we have the data to show what our policy is, it shows that we're focusing on the right things. And we're also tracking not only what the court did, but what our recommendations were. So we're able to effectively make our argument about why we've done certain things. And to John's point that he made a couple minutes ago, not focus in on a single case here or there and have it blown out of proportion, but to take a look at a system-wide issue to show that we're driving change in safety.
And the system-wide issue is so critical because what you're also doing is addressing mass incarceration with this work. And as John mentioned, that we incarcerate at, I think, a rate higher than any other country on the planet, 6 to 7 times the rate. John, I want to talk to you about a couple of the dashboards that you've done and just take us through what one dashboard you think was the most effective, and tell us about it.
Well, like I said earlier, like our dashboard is, it's an act of, I think, transparency and saying and building trust to say, you know, you can hold us accountable. But we have, if you look at our dashboard really carefully, you will see that there's a lot of narrative that's put in there. And a lot of that is because we were just so concerned about this data. Like, how is this going to be used by people? Will it be used as a sword and not understand the full picture of what this data means? And again, it's limited because it's just one data point, which is our data. And there's so much other things to be looking at if we want to comprehensively think about how we can improve safety and justice. I think another way that you can use the data dashboard very effectively is the way that Steve's doing it, which is to um, advance a narrative or advance a priority and then show your work, right? And that's an example what we see in Fairfax, which is a great, and I think more reform-minded prosecutors need to be doing that because, again, if you don't have the data to show, first of all, that the community should trust what you said during the campaign or what you said you were going to do, but also at the same time to make it certain, because I think in many places around the country, reform-minded prosecutors are losing the battle about whether or not they care about the community safety aspect of the job. And the truth is that I've yet to meet a reform-minded prosecutor that doesn't care about it. They care deeply about it. But oftentimes the other forces are there to kind of show other data or just go back to that more traditional mindset that punishment is the way to stop all of this. And that's just simply not true. There's other research out there that would say otherwise, that it's more important to actually catch the individuals, right? So there's a limitation about the data that we have, but we allow people to search, and they can again cut the information across race and gender. We also show referral data, and they'll see that that in many instances where things are a priority for our community, the referrals of certain types of really serious crimes have dramatically decreased. Now, I tell people that doesn't mean that crime has decreased, but it means that we're not investigating those cases. And what we need to do is have a broader and bigger conversation about what do we need to do so that cases come in and we are actually investigating, because the incidents are still happening, right? And so it's really our data dashboard is not going to like answer the question for somebody, but it should allow for people to start exploring some of that data, possibly answer some questions, but they're not going to have the full picture. And we encourage people to contact us. And so oftentimes I'll get calls from people in our community who have a concern about something, and then I'll take them through our dashboard and we'll also share with them other information. Like we have we share information with our police. Our police have to report their clearance rates to the FBI. And so we have oftentimes lots of conversations about what cases don't get presented to our office for us to do anything about. And I also think the notion of just recognizing that just a simple data point in our system isn't going to be necessarily the path to the comprehensive solution. So partnering with the researchers um, to do that more deeper dive. So as an example, I'll just be very quick, but one of the things that we found just with some simple research is that Black motorists in our community were subject to being stopped for non-public safety reasons, like an air freshener or expired tab, 4 times more than white motorists, and 9 times more subject to a search. And we used that to have some conversations about, and that was through research, had conversations with our stakeholders, and then we built out a program to change all of that. So now we have a set of policies in my office, as well as some guidelines from participating police agencies to stop doing that and instead focus more on moving violations. And so we partnered with the Justice Innovation Lab, and we have comprehensive research that shows the before and after we made the change in September of 2021, right in the midst of the pandemic and also the rise in violent crime. And I knew that we would get a lot of pushback. In fact, it's the most pushback that I've ever received on anything that I've done in this office. But 2 years later, we were able to show the 1 year later data. And what it showed is that those communities where the police did not participate in this program, their crime rates actually increased more. We had no negative impact on gun recoveries. And in fact, we had a lot of anecdotal type of research through surveys and interviews that showed that we were gaining legitimacy and trust in our policing function as well as our criminal justice function. So that's the type of change where I think if you use the data, mesh it together, have a third party work with you and build out. And again, it's just kind of what Steve was talking about. It's so important that we advance our reform agenda and the narratives that we want to settle into this country in terms of a mental model, that we've got to prove it.
Absolutely. And proving it is something that's key. I want to talk now with Jema, because a huge part of a data program is having ability to make mistakes. And we want to talk about some of the struggles, the challenges. Jema, take us through 1 or 2 key things to avoid when you're trying to build a data program, a data dashboard, and share that with us.
I'm not sure about avoiding, but I think 2 critical components that you need to bring on board. One is definitely technical expertise. You need, I think, in terms of our case management system, when I came on board, there was a huge learning curve to understand the system and just to reconfigure the system. So we were really fortunate to have the financial resources and to develop a good working relationship with the vendor of our case management system so that we could reconfigure the system. And we really needed their technical expertise to do that. We also...
I want to also highlight, I think, Jema, that's an incredibly important point. The case management system for most offices are outdated and they need upgrades. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
We actually, I don't think this is necessarily an outdated, this case management system was implemented in, I think, 2019. It wasn't, and there's been several upgrades since it's eProsecutor is what we use. It's, I think the journey has really just been understanding it, upgrading it, but also customizing it to collect the data that we want to collect. I think that's the big thing. Sure, a lot of offices have sort of data case management systems that are really clunky. Ours is probably, I think it's a good system overall. It's very difficult to reconfigure. So we really needed the expertise of the vendor to do that. We also really needed the expertise of some of the other partners. We've worked with various partners, and yourself included. We needed the expertise of programmers to help us extract the data. Our case management system is the database is SQL, so we needed an SQL programmer to help us extract that data. That was a huge challenge. To get the data to make sense, to extract it in a way that it made sense. And so fortunately, we were also able to work with a really great Tableau developer that helped us make sense of the data as we pulled it out of our system and started to use it for analytics. So I think that technical expertise and getting it, being able to afford it, being able to get it is a critical, that was sort of the critical component that I think is probably one of the biggest challenges that so many offices have.
Agreed. I think a tremendous challenge is, for instance, who to hire, who to bring on, whether part-time, full-time, an external partner. And my point is, it really does take probably multiple partners helping an office at different points in the office's journey for a data program. Now, we have about 15 more minutes. I want to talk about another topic. We've covered data dashboards and prosecutorial independence. We've also talked about community engagement. But I want to talk about something that's very important to me, which is how do you get buy-in from lawyers who do not deal with data dashboards as something that's part of their normal day-to-day work? I'm going to start with Steve, and then we'll pivot to John.
This is, Allison, I'm glad you asked that question. This is something that, as you know, I feel very, very passionately about. I think the most important, to my mind, of course, technical expertise, all of that is incredibly important. You can't have it without, but you also can't have a successful data program if you do not build a culture of data. And what I mean by that is you have to build your policies and procedures around the data. Jayma talked about changing our case management system. We changed our case management system around. We reconfigured it because data was at the core of what we were doing. If you try to have a data program as, oh, that's nice, we should just do that and people should do that on the side, it won't work. It has to be your culture. And to make it your culture, that means a couple of things. You have to try to get people to buy into it. You have to realize that you as an elected official, your goals, your vision might be the same as your line attorneys, but on a day-to-day basis, sometimes your interests aren't always aligned, right? A lot of attorneys want to just do their cases and be done. We want them to do their cases, but we need this data. So that means doing a lot of work to try to get people on board, trying to explain to them why this is important, why it's important to the community, why it actually makes their life better, because having the data actually does make their life better in a number of different ways. Now you go through that process, and what I'm going to say next is a thing that a lot of people don't like to hear, but if you are actually building a culture of data, if you're actually building a culture, part of building that culture is getting rid of people who do not fit into that culture. So you have to get rid of them or make it very, very clear that if they're not going to be part of their culture, that we will help them move on, but they should move on. And once you do that, that's a huge hurdle, but it doesn't end there. It requires that, at your supervisors, you're all the way up to me as an elected official, you have to be on fire for this data. We are checking this constantly. We are asking about it, people about it constantly. We're holding people accountable. There's nobody in my office. If you asked anybody in my office, hey, what's the thing that Steve's probably going to ask you about today? 9 times out of 10, he's going to ask you about some piece of data. And that's the culture, because people know that they're going to be held accountable for it. And that seems, wow, that might be heavy-handed. It's not, right? That's how you build a culture. And what we have now, after doing that for some period of time, the lawyers, the paralegals, the admins we have in our office now, they're excited for it. They've seen how it has helped them. They've seen how it has helped them make better decisions, do more for the community. And the question I get now isn't, why are we doing this data stuff? The question I get over and over again is, what's the next thing that we're going to do with data? People in my office are pitching me about ideas. Well, we should have a dashboard about this. Can we build a dashboard about that? That, to me, is success. And the only way to get there is to do the hard work of trying to build that culture, which includes trying to do the yeoman's work of trying to show how it's in their interest and get buy-in and going to the wall to do that. And then for the odd 1 or 2 people or however many people that don't want to do that, make it very, very clear to them that, hey, this is our culture. If you can't fit in, let's talk about where your future might be better served.
Absolutely. I want to highlight the culture because this is a huge part of this webinar. Because if you don't have buy-in from the attorneys, from line prosecutors to executive level and all the supervisors, everything we're talking about will not work, arguably. John, how did you handle it in your office?
Well, that's so true, Allison. Culture will eat policy for lunch any day of the week. So it is so important to make sure that people understand the why. Like, why are we collecting all this data? Because we're trying to make change. Someone once said that what gets measured changes, and I think Steve office is a perfect example. He's paying attention to this particular data point because it matters, but it's important to explain to the entire staff, especially the middle managers, because they're the ones who oftentimes are going to be the ones that will have to enforce the rules about entering this data properly. Because if you don't put in data properly, or if people are not committed to it, if you have garbage in, you're going to have garbage out, and you're not going to have good data. So I think that piece of it is just really critical, a big part of. And I think just so that people understand too, you don't necessarily have to have like an expansive data dashboard for every data point in your office that's maybe like internal. They should have across America, hopefully a competent case management system that can generate reports. But then it's important to understand how to maximize the use of the case management system. But then it does start top down to have conversations about what your priorities are in terms of what that data, what you want it to look like, sharing that data with your managers, and then having conversations about it. But if you don't have that infrastructure in place, you're just kind of like you're just like a rubber stamp for like whatever comes in the door, and you process cases, and that's kind of what you do. And for the most part, traditionally, historically, we have put marks on people that would signify some sort of conviction. We might um, have them committed to the Department of Corrections. And we've just done that over and over again. And no business, no company, no profession should operate like that. We should be asking questions. We should be asking, what is it that we want to be building at the end of the assembly line, and take measures to actually influence that. And you can't do that unless you're measuring it.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes until the end of the hour. What I'm going to do now is ask each of the electeds to tell me what is their vision for the next 4 years and how would they like to use their data program. And we'll start with Steve.
Oh my goodness, that is an expansive question. Because as you know, as you can all tell, I'm a big believer in it. One of the things that we've always been driving towards, and John has mentioned and has done a lot of great work on this, which is really using data to get at social and economic disparities. That is, our vision for this data program is to not only be able to tell the community what we're up to manage stuff, but to help us make better decisions and to get to better outcomes and more fair outcomes. So what we plan to do over the next couple of years with our data program is really strengthen our partnerships with research universities to take a look at our data to help us get a really solid statistical understanding of what's happening that we can work backwards from to even improve even further the racial and socioeconomic equity issues that are inherent in the system. The other thing that's really, really important as a reformer, as somebody who, as John said, understands that putting people in jail and prison over and over and over again is not necessarily solving the problem, is expanding our diversion portfolio, and not only expanding it, putting people in programs, but doing different things and measuring it to see what has the best outcome, right? And using those outcomes to say, okay, this is a program that we want to put more resources and more people into because it has this high success rate. This other thing that we're doing, it's good, but it's not quite as good, so let's focus over here. So that is, to me, what I think is in our office, the next version of what we're doing with data. We've started to make data-driven decisions. We started to do certain things, but we really want to kick that into overdrive and have that really help us grow these other pieces of the justice system that I think are going to be major pieces of it over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have two questions from the audience, and then I will pivot to you, John, to get your vision for your office for the next few years. And I think these are going to be questions, Jema, that you may want to give some input in. The first question is by Marcus McKay. It says, how long did it take to understand the existing case management system, reconfiguration, recustomization, and then training? So this is from the senior data analyst at the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Jema, do you want to give a
Yeah.
little bit of insight about that?
Just really quickly, I came on about 3 years ago. And I would say it probably took about a year and a half, probably about a year and a half to get the system to kind of a reasonable place. And to start getting in place good, standard operating procedures for data collection for our admin staff who primarily who enter the data. And then our quality assurance, we sort of did some reconfiguration, did the training and the operating procedures. Then in the past year, we've really worked on the quality assurance pieces. So we're at 3 years now, and I think we've probably got about a good year and a half. We've got about a year and a half worth of data that I think is good and reliable. But so I would say a year and a half to build it and another year to really work out your quality assurance pieces. So 3 years to get, I think, at least a year of good data going. So that's just sort of my assessment.
Thank you for that snapshot of a time frame. That's really useful. I'm going to pivot now to John, your vision for your office before we run out of time.
Well, I think it's a lot of what Steve said, continuing with having data and research as an integral part of the change, and also staying with the change. I mean, I think you shouldn't just have an evaluation or research or data and release it to the public one time and not stick with it, because again, you've got to stick with the data. So for instance, like on the non-public safety traffic stops, we're going to continue to pull all of the there are stops across the county and look at it across race, and just continue to evaluate. And then any new initiatives that we have, there's always a data and evaluation component that we build into what we're going to be doing. So we'll continue doing that, partnering with research organizations or building out some way in which we're going to report our own data back to the community, because at the end of the day, it's not just about launching a project, but it's also about, and I think Steve's dashboard does a great job of showing fidelity to what was the vision when the change occurred.
Absolutely. We're close to the end. I'm going to close us out by saying thank you all to the panelists for joining, and also thank you to our audience. What we talked about today were some highlights, big picture steps on how to build a data program, how to utilize it to talk to your community, implement reform, address racial disparities, stem mass incarceration, and really make impact. We covered quite a bit, but I wanted to share this with you all because I know this work is transformational and is making impact across the country. Just to close out, we will be sending an email with the links of the dashboards from the Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney's Office, as well as the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. And we will also have in that link a whole host of other dashboards from around the country. We want you all to see what is possible. And my ask for everyone joining is, if you're interested about what we shared, if you think your office needs a data program, then go to these two offices' website, because they are, again, models for the nation as to how you can create a data program and utilize it to implement real change. Thank you all for joining.